Brenda Delgado, a woman of unremarkable origins, grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of Dallas, Texas. From an early age, Brenda was known for her ambition. She was the type who wouldn't settle for a modest life, always aspiring for something greater, something more luxurious. Her charm and beauty became her ticket to the lifestyle she craved, and she quickly learned how to use them to her advantage. By the time she reached adulthood, she had mastered the art of seduction and manipulation, honing her skills with a series of wealthy men who fell under her spell. Among her acquaintances, Brenda was seen as someone who always had her sights set on bigger things, be it money, status, or power. When Brenda met Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, it seemed as though she had finally found her golden ticket. Ricardo was everything she had ever dreamed of: wealthy, successful, and generous. He was a respected dermatologist with a flourishing career and a reputation for his philanthropic work. Their relationship began as a whirlwind romance, filled with expensive dinners, exotic vacations, and lavish gifts. To outsiders, they appeared to be the perfect couple, he, the dashing doctor, and she, the beautiful girlfriend. But beneath the surface, there was trouble brewing. As the relationship progressed, Brenda's demands grew more frequent and more extravagant. What started as occasional gifts soon became constant requests for expensive items and trips, all funded by Ricardo's hard-earned money. Over time, Ricardo began to feel the strain of Brenda's relentless pursuit of luxury. The once joyous relationship turned into a cycle of arguments, with Ricardo growing increasingly frustrated with Brenda's insatiable desire for more. Friends of the couple noticed a change in Ricardo. He seemed more stressed, more withdrawn, and less enthusiastic about the relationship. But Brenda was undeterred. She had her eyes set on a life of wealth and comfort, and she wasn't about to let anything or anyone stand in her way. The cracks in their relationship became more apparent as Brenda's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would often lash out at Ricardo for perceived slights, accusing him of not caring enough or not providing enough. Ricardo, who was deeply invested in his career, found it difficult to balance the demands of his professional life with the constant emotional turmoil at home. The couple's arguments became more frequent, and their relationship more volatile. Ricardo, despite his growing reservations, continued to support Brenda financially, hoping that things would eventually calm down. But Brenda was growing impatient. She had invested too much time and effort into this relationship to see it end without reaping the reward she believed she deserved. Her thoughts turned dark as she began to contemplate ways to secure her financial future once and for all. Brenda knew that if Ricardo were out of the picture, she could stand to gain everything she had ever wanted: money, status, and the freedom to live the life she had always dreamed of. And so, she began to formulate a plan that would ensure Ricardo's wealth would be hers, without the need to continue the charade of a relationship that had long lost its appeal. As Brenda's plans took shape, she began to distance herself emotionally from Ricardo. She knew that in order to carry out her plan, she would need to play the part of the grieving girlfriend convincingly. Brenda became more calculating, more cold, and more determined than ever to see her plan through. She knew the risks involved, but the potential rewards far outweighed them in her mind. To Brenda, this was her ticket to the life she had always wanted, and she wasn't going to let anything get in her way. The transformation in Brenda did not go unnoticed. Friends and family began to see a different side of her, a side that was more ruthless, more driven, and more willing to do whatever it took to achieve her goals. But no one could have imagined the lengths she would go to in order to secure her future. Brenda's charm, which had once been her greatest asset, now served as a mask, hiding the sinister thoughts that were brewing beneath the surface. Little did Ricardo know that the woman he had fallen in love with was plotting his demise, and that their once loving relationship was about to take a deadly turn. The relationship between Brenda and Ricardo continued to deteriorate, with each passing day bringing more tension and more conflict. Ricardo, who had once been enamored with Brenda's beauty and charm, now found himself questioning the very foundation of their relationship. The arguments, once minor disagreements, had escalated into full-blown confrontations, with Brenda often accusing Ricardo of not caring enough, of not providing enough, of not being enough. Ricardo, who was dedicated to his work, found it increasingly difficult to manage the demands of his relationship alongside his professional responsibilities. As the pressure mounted, Ricardo began to withdraw, spending more time at work and less time at home. He hoped that by distancing himself, he could avoid the constant conflict that had come to define their relationship. But Brenda saw this as a betrayal, further fueling her resentment and anger. She began to suspect that Ricardo was losing interest in her, that he was planning to leave her, and that her dreams of a luxurious future were slipping away. Brenda's desperation grew with each passing day. She became more possessive, more demanding, and more erratic in her behavior. She would frequently confront Ricardo, accusing him of infidelity, of neglect, of not appreciating her. Ricardo, who had once been patient and understanding, found himself growing increasingly frustrated and disillusioned. The relationship that had once brought him happiness was now a source of constant stress and anxiety. He began to confide in close friends about the difficulties he was facing, expressing his concerns about Brenda's behavior and his doubts about their future together. Despite the growing tension, Ricardo continued to support Brenda financially, hoping that things would eventually improve. He was a man of principles, and he believed in keeping his commitments. But Brenda saw his continued support as a weakness, something she could exploit to her advantage. She began to make even more demands, pushing Ricardo to his limits. She wanted more money, more gifts, more attention, and she was determined to get it, no matter the cost. As the relationship continued to spiral downward, Brenda's thoughts grew darker. She realized that Ricardo was no longer the golden ticket she had once believed him to be. The constant arguments, the dwindling financial support, and the increasing distance between them made her realize that the life she had envisioned was slipping through her fingers. Brenda knew that if she didn't act soon, she would lose everything she had worked so hard to obtain. It was during this time that Brenda began to seriously consider the unthinkable. She started to research ways to ensure that she would be financially secure, even if Ricardo was no longer in the picture. Her thoughts turned to murder, and she began to plot how she could make Ricardo's death look like an accident. Brenda was meticulous in her planning, leaving nothing to chance. She knew that in order to get away with it, she would need to be careful, calculated, and cold-blooded. Brenda's behavior became even more erratic as she delved deeper into her plan. She would have sudden outbursts of anger, followed by periods of calm, where she would act as though nothing was wrong. Ricardo, who was already on edge, found these mood swings difficult to handle. He began to suspect that something was seriously wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He still loved Brenda, despite everything, and he wanted to believe that they could work things out. But the truth was that Brenda had already made up her mind. The tension in their relationship reached a boiling point one night when an argument erupted over something trivial. Brenda's anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks, finally boiled over. She screamed at Ricardo, accusing him of betraying her, of ruining her life, of not giving her what she deserved. Ricardo, who had always tried to remain calm during their arguments, found himself at a loss for words. He didn't recognize the woman standing before him, the woman who had once been the love of his life. That night, Ricardo made a decision. He couldn't continue living like this, in a state of constant tension and uncertainty. He decided that it was time to end the relationship, to move on, and to focus on his career and his own well-being. He planned to talk to Brenda the next day, to have an honest conversation about their future, and to let her know that it was time for them to go their separate ways. But Brenda, sensing that Ricardo was slipping away, made a decision of her own. She knew that if Ricardo left her, she would lose everything: his financial support, the lifestyle she had become accustomed to, and the future she had dreamed of. She couldn't let that happen. And so, that night, as Ricardo slept, Brenda finalized her plan. She would make sure that he never left her, that he would never betray her, that he would never take away the life she had fought so hard to secure. The next morning, Ricardo woke up unaware that his fate had already been sealed. He went about his day as usual, preparing for work, planning his schedule, and mentally rehearsing the conversation he was going to have with Brenda that evening. But as the day wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Brenda was unusually calm, almost too calm, and he found himself wondering if she had sensed what he was planning to say. Little did he know that Brenda was already several steps ahead of him, her plan set in motion, and her mind focused on one thing: getting what she believed she deserved, at any cost. Ricardo returned home that evening, ready to have the difficult conversation he had been dreading all day. He rehearsed his words in his mind, wanting to be as gentle and compassionate as possible. He still cared for Brenda, despite everything, and he didn't want to hurt her. But he knew that ending the relationship was the right thing to do, for both of them. When Ricardo walked through the door, he was surprised to find Brenda in a surprisingly good mood. She greeted him with a smile and suggested that they have dinner together, something they hadn't done in a long time. Ricardo, caught off guard by her sudden change in demeanor, agreed, thinking that maybe this was a sign that things could end amicably. As they sat down to dinner, Brenda was unusually attentive, asking Ricardo about his day, his work, and his plans for the future. Ricardo, feeling a sense of relief, began to open up, telling Brenda about his hopes and dreams, and gently steering the conversation towards the topic of their relationship. He explained that he felt it was time for them to go their separate ways, that they had grown apart, and that it was in both of their best interests to move on. But as Ricardo spoke, Brenda's demeanor began to change. The smile on her face faded, and her eyes grew cold. She listened intently, nodding occasionally, but saying very little. Ricardo, sensing the tension, tried to reassure her, telling her that he would always care for her and that he would make sure she was taken care of financially, even after they broke up. But Brenda wasn't interested in Ricardo's reassurances. In her mind, she had already decided that there was only one way this relationship was going to end. She waited for Ricardo to finish speaking, and then, in a calm and measured tone, she told him that she understood his decision, that she respected his feelings, and that she wanted to make sure they ended things on good terms. Ricardo, relieved that the conversation had gone better than he had expected, thanked Brenda for her understanding and suggested that they start making plans for the breakup. But before he could say anything else, Brenda interrupted him, suggesting that they take one last trip together, as a way of saying goodbye. She proposed a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the mountains, a place where they could relax, clear their minds, and part ways on a positive note. Ricardo, who was emotionally drained from the conversation, hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. He thought that maybe a weekend away would give them both the closure they needed, and he wanted to do everything he could to make the breakup as painless as possible for Brenda. He didn't know that Brenda had no intention of letting him come back from that trip alive. In the days leading up to the trip, Brenda meticulously planned every detail. She researched the remote cabin, making sure it was isolated enough that no one would hear or see anything suspicious. She purchased the necessary supplies, including a bottle of her favorite wine, which she planned to use to toast their final night together. But Brenda wasn't planning on toasting their relationship, she was planning on poisoning Ricardo, ensuring that he wouldn't live to see the next day. The night before the trip, Brenda couldn't sleep. She lay awake, going over her plan in her mind, making sure that everything was in place. She knew that once they arrived at the cabin, there would be no turning back. She had to be cold, calculated, and ruthless, just as she had been throughout the entire relationship. But as the night wore on, doubt began to creep into her mind. Could she really go through with it? Could she really take another person's life? But then she thought about the alternative, the life she would be forced to live without Ricardo's financial support, the life of struggle and hardship that she had always feared. And with that thought, her resolve hardened. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, Brenda and Ricardo set off for the cabin. The drive was long and winding, taking them deep into the mountains, far away from civilization. Ricardo, who was still under the impression that this trip was a way to say goodbye, was in good spirits, chatting and laughing with Brenda as they drove. But Brenda was quiet, her mind focused on the task ahead. She knew that once they reached the cabin, she would have to act quickly and decisively. When they finally arrived, Ricardo was impressed by the beauty of the location. The cabin was nestled in a secluded clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees and overlooking a serene lake. It was the perfect place to unwind, to forget about the stresses of life, and to enjoy each other's company one last time. Brenda, playing the part of the loving girlfriend, suggested that they go for a hike before dinner, and Ricardo, eager to make the most of their time together, agreed. As they hiked through the forest, Brenda kept her distance, allowing Ricardo to walk ahead of her. She knew that this would be the perfect opportunity to put her plan into motion. She had brought a small vial of poison with her, hidden in her jacket pocket, and she planned to slip it into Ricardo's drink once they returned to the cabin. But as they walked, she found herself hesitating. The reality of what she was about to do was starting to sink in, and for a moment, she wondered if she could really go through with it. But then, as they reached a clearing in the forest, Brenda saw her opportunity. Ricardo had stopped to admire the view, and she quickly reached into her pocket, pulling out the vial. Her hands trembled as she unscrewed the cap, but she knew that she couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. She had to act now, before she lost her nerve. With a quick, decisive motion, she poured the contents of the vial into Ricardo's water bottle, careful not to spill a drop. Ricardo, unaware of what Brenda had just done, took a sip from his bottle and smiled at her, thanking her for planning this trip. Brenda forced a smile in return, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that the poison would take some time to work, and she had to remain calm and composed until it did. They continued their hike, with Ricardo none the wiser, while Brenda's mind raced with thoughts of what was about to happen. When they finally returned to the cabin, Ricardo began to feel the effects of the poison. He complained of feeling lightheaded and dizzy, and Brenda, feigning concern, suggested that he lie down for a while. Ricardo agreed, not realizing that he was already a dead man walking. As he lay on the bed, Brenda sat by his side, pretending to comfort him, all the while watching as the poison slowly took its toll. Ricardo's condition worsened rapidly, and within minutes, he was unconscious. Brenda knew that it was only a matter of time before he was gone for good. She stood up, leaving the room, and walked out onto the porch, where she stood in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest. She felt a strange sense of calm, knowing that her plan had worked, and that she was about to get everything she had ever wanted. But as she stood there, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had taken a life, snuffed out the existence of a man who had once loved her, all for the sake of money and power. The weight of her actions began to press down on her, and she realized that she would have to live with this for the rest of her life. No amount of money, no amount of luxury, could ever erase the memory of what she had done. Brenda returned to the cabin, her hands shaking as she approached Ricardo's lifeless body. She knew that she had to make it look like an accident, that she had to cover her tracks, but the sight of Ricardo lying there, so still and quiet, was almost too much to bear. She forced herself to move, to go through the motions of cleaning up, of staging the scene, of making sure that no one would ever suspect her of foul play. But as Brenda went about her grim task, she couldn't escape the feeling that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had become a murderer, and no matter how well she covered her tracks, she knew that the truth would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to come to light. The luxury and wealth she had sought so desperately now seemed hollow, tainted by the blood that had been spilled to obtain them. As Brenda left the cabin, leaving Ricardo's body behind, she knew that her life would never be the same. She had achieved her goal, but at what cost? The future she had dreamed of now seemed bleak, overshadowed by the guilt and shame that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Brenda had won, but in the end, she had lost everything that truly mattered. The tranquil mountain cabin, once a symbol of a fresh start, had now become the center of a police investigation. When Ricardo Paniagua was reported missing, it set off a series of events that would unravel Brenda Delgado's meticulously crafted plan. The initial reports were vague, with Brenda claiming that Ricardo had disappeared during their hike, but as the days passed, the discrepancies in her story began to attract attention. Ricardo's family and friends were quick to notice his absence, growing increasingly concerned when he failed to return their calls or show up for planned appointments. They reported him missing, and soon, local authorities began their search. The isolated location of the cabin made the search challenging, but they were determined to find any trace of Ricardo. When authorities finally reached the cabin, Brenda was there to greet them, her face a mask of worry and distress. She recounted the events leading up to Ricardo's disappearance, emphasizing her concern and the suddenness of his vanishing act. Her account seemed convincing at first, but investigators soon noticed inconsistencies in her story. Brenda's inability to provide clear details about their last moments together, coupled with her increasingly erratic behavior, raised red flags. The investigators began to dig deeper into Brenda's background. They discovered her history of relationships with wealthy men and her apparent pattern of demanding and manipulating. While there was no concrete evidence linking her to any criminal activity, the pattern of behavior suggested a motive. As they probed further, they found that Brenda had been spending lavishly on herself during the time of Ricardo's disappearance, using funds that had no clear source. As the investigation progressed, forensic teams examined the cabin for any signs of foul play. The initial results were inconclusive, with no obvious evidence of a struggle or violent altercation. However, the cabin was thoroughly searched, and Brenda's personal belongings were scrutinized. Among the items found were receipts for the poison used to kill Ricardo, and forensic experts began to piece together the grim details of what had occurred. Brenda, meanwhile, was growing increasingly anxious. The police scrutiny, coupled with the media coverage of Ricardo's disappearance, was beginning to wear on her. She had to maintain her composure and continue to play the part of the grieving girlfriend, all while the walls were closing in. Her attempts to stay in the public eye, giving interviews and appealing for information about Ricardo's whereabouts, were carefully monitored by investigators. The breakthrough in the case came when forensic analysis revealed traces of poison in the cabin's drinking water. The confirmation that Ricardo had been poisoned provided a significant lead for investigators. They re-interviewed Brenda, focusing on her interactions with Ricardo and her financial situation. As the evidence mounted, Brenda's story began to unravel. Detectives found inconsistencies in her alibi and discovered that her recent financial expenditures did not align with her reported income. Under mounting pressure, Brenda's behavior became increasingly erratic. She made a series of contradictory statements and began to show signs of nervousness. The investigators, noticing the change in her demeanor, decided to confront her with the new evidence. They questioned her about the poison and her financial situation, presenting her with the evidence they had gathered. At this point, Brenda's facade began to crumble. Faced with irrefutable evidence of her involvement in Ricardo's death, she struggled to maintain her innocence. The tension in the interrogation room was palpable as detectives pressed her for answers. Brenda's attempts to deflect and deny her involvement were futile, the evidence against her was overwhelming. Finally, in a moment of desperation, Brenda confessed to the crime. She described in detail how she had poisoned Ricardo, her motives driven by a desire for his wealth and the fear of losing the life she had become accustomed to. Her confession was a mixture of remorse and resignation, as she grappled with the reality of what she had done. With Brenda's confession, the investigation into Ricardo's murder drew to a close. Brenda was charged with first-degree murder, and the case became a media sensation. The story of the ambitious woman who had killed for money captivated the public, with news outlets covering every detail of the trial. Brenda's trial was a high-profile event, drawing attention from across the nation as the story of her crime unfolded in the courtroom. Throughout the trial, Brenda's defense team attempted to argue that her actions were the result of emotional instability and a troubled relationship. However, the prosecution painted a clear picture of premeditated murder, driven by greed and a desire for financial gain. The evidence against Brenda was overwhelming, and the jury quickly reached a verdict. Brenda Delgado was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase of the trial was marked by emotional testimony from Ricardo's family and friends, who spoke of the impact of his death and the betrayal they felt. Brenda's own testimony was filled with regret and sorrow, but it did little to sway the court's decision. In the end, Brenda was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was a stark reminder of the cost of her ambition and the lengths she had gone to secure a life of luxury. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed and the consequences of betraying those who love us. As Brenda began her life sentence, she faced the reality of her actions. The future she had once dreamed of was now forever out of reach, replaced by a life of confinement and reflection on the choices that had led her to this point. The luxury and wealth she had so desperately sought were replaced by the stark reality of prison life, a constant reminder of the price she had paid for her ambition. The story of Brenda Delgado serves as a powerful reminder of the destructive potential of unchecked ambition and greed. Her journey from a charming young woman with dreams of a luxurious life to a convicted murderer is a testament to the lengths some will go to achieve their desires. The case has become a subject of fascination and discussion, prompting many to reflect on the moral and ethical implications of her actions. Brenda's rise and fall illustrate how ambition, when combined with a lack of moral boundaries, can lead to devastating consequences. Her initial charm and beauty masked a ruthless determination to achieve her goals, no matter the cost. The relationships she formed and the manipulations she employed were all part of a calculated effort to secure a life of wealth and comfort. The impact of Brenda's actions extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of Ricardo Paniagua's death. His family and friends were left to grapple with the loss of a loved one and the betrayal of someone they had trusted. The media coverage of the case brought attention to the darker aspects of human nature, sparking discussions about morality, justice, and the consequences of greed. In prison, Brenda's life took on a new dimension as she faced the reality of her crime. Her days were now defined by the confines of her cell and the reflection on the choices that had led her to this point. The luxury and status she had once coveted were replaced by the stark reality of incarceration, a constant reminder of the cost of her ambition. The story of Brenda Delgado remains a cautionary tale about the perils of letting ambition overshadow morality. It serves as a reminder that the pursuit of wealth and power, when driven by greed and a lack of ethical considerations, can lead to devastating outcomes. Brenda's journey from a woman with dreams to a convicted murderer underscores the importance of maintaining integrity and recognizing the true value of relationships and trust. In the end, Brenda's story is a poignant example of how ambition, when left unchecked, can consume and destroy. The life she had once envisioned for herself, filled with luxury and success, was forever marred by the consequences of her actions. Her story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of maintaining moral boundaries and the profound impact that greed and ambition can have on our lives and the lives of those around us. If you found Brenda Delgado's chilling story both gripping and unsettling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update on our latest content. Have your own thoughts or theories about this case? Share them in the comments below, we'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want to dive even deeper into the world of true crime, check out our recommended videos and stay tuned for more gripping tales. Thank you for watching, and remember to stay curious and informed.